Another important library that we usually wanted to learn about when you wanted to work with MongoDB is Mongoose. Mongoose is really an important tool, and it's just like a recommended way to deal with data from your Node application. So what is Mongoose? Mongoose is an object data modeling, or some people would call it ODM. So if you are coming from the background of relational database, you might have heard about the term ORM, or let's say object relational modeling. So the way that these kind of abstractions work is it provides you with an additional layer of logic, where you can build most of your logic there, and to just like to keep your application more neat and more isolated for each part of it. So based on the definition from their website, they are saying it's a straightforward schema-based solution to model your application data. So from this one, we know that MongoDB in nature is not schema-based. So not schema-based might try some problem when it comes to implementation. So since like most of the time you will have to do some validation, you will have to do some let's say checking on the things that you want to insert to your database. So schema based means that you want to control what kind of data to ensure the consistency, to ensure even the data integrity of your data, right? So another thing which is including their website, which is it includes a built-in type casting, validation, query building, business logic hooks, and more out of the box, which means like when we started to work with the native MongoDB driver with Nodejs, we know that whenever we wanted to check some of the data there, and we will see it like in a bit, but when we wanted to insert some data, we can just like insert whatever we want. So let's say with the model that we built in the previous demo, we had ID and the name. And from our perspective, we see like the ID, it should be numeric value. But what if the user enter, let's say, a text value? To overcome this problem, you would usually have a validation there. You would usually go with, let's say, doing some process, some validation to make sure that all the data that you wanted to insert to the database is in the right way, right? So the way that we just like use with Mongoose is instead of just like trying everything or try to write everything by ourselves, we can have whatever we want based on the building schema that we want, as we will see. So in our demo here for Mongoose, we'll try to see like how can we interact with Mongoose ODM, and we will try to perform almost the same operation as what we did back in let's say in MongoDB. So let's go back to our code here, and let's try to see the things that we done last time when we build like, or we used MongoDB or native MongoDB. And as you can see here, it's just like we enter the data wherever we want. So let's say if you wanted to go back to the insert operation. So the insert operation, we would expect something from the user. So this value here is a static values. So let's just like uncomment this out. So the number here, which is 10, it's just like fixed or static here. And the name, it's just like here, is string and static. But the thing is, if we are receiving this data from the end user or from the visitor of your website, then the end user might not enter a number here. He might enter text, he might enter anything else, right? And even like with the name, he might just like enter a numeric value instead of just like inserting a string. So to make sure that it's just like in the right format, you will have to write some validation here. To make sure that the ID in the right format and the name is in the right format. But when it comes to MongoDB or Mongoose, you are just like, don't need all of this, because when you build your own schema, you will have all these functionalities built in. And even you can just like do additional stuff as we will see. So to start to work with these things, I will have to go to the command line here. Then we will go with, the first thing to do is to install Mongoose. So npm install Mongoose. So once it's installed here, what we should do, I'll try to do like almost the same operation as what we did here to see like how much things is a way easier when we wanted to do some of the stuff here. So I will go to do one thing here, which is I'm gonna do crud mongoose.js, and I would go to create a directory here to build our model or to build our schema. So I will call this models here. And in this model folder here, I'm gonna add the first schema. So the schema that we had there is we have the name and the ID, and we call this one is names, right? So let's go here and let's go with, first let's import the MongoDB. So let's say const mongoose equal to require mongoose. So this is the first thing to do. Another thing to do here is to try to define, I don't want to have it here. Yeah, I wanted to just like have a model here. Let's call it names dot, let's call it schema.js. Okay, so what I want to do here is to import the schema. Let's do the schema for the table that we got, right? So let's go with const. I would call it name schema equal. So I will instantiate a new instance of Mongoose schema. So I would go with Mongoose schema here. Then I will define my own schema. So my own schema is going to be an object. So you are passing an object to the schema here. So if you remember, we had two parameters, or we had two keys, right? So the first one is going to be ID, and the second one would be the name, right? These are the two parameters that we got, right? So the second parameter here for the schema would be the name of the collection. So it means you want to create this schema, these keys or these properties here, but you want to create it where? In which one? Okay, so I'm gonna go here and I will do one thing, which is the name of the schema. Okay, so the name of the schema here is names. Okay, and here in the ID, I would have all the restrictions or the control or the policy that I wanted to enforce on this specific key. So I would go with first type. I would need to have it as a number, for example. And the number, I want it to be a required. So required means I will not accept any insert unless there's an ID. So if you receive an object from the user which doesn't have the ID, then the insert will be refused. Okay? Even you can just like do unique and let's say true. So let's just like hold on a little bit here and try to discuss what's going on. So in MongoDB, if you wanted to enforce these, let's say just like these three parameters here, what you would do, you would have to go through steps as follow, right? To make sure it's number, you would do something like validate its number, right? So you will validate this one, then you be good. Then you want to check whether it's required or not. You will validate if the value has been passed, right? The last one would be a unique. So to validate and ensure it's unique, you would go and perform find by ID, right? Because you wanted to check, is there any entry or any document in your collection with this ID or not? And the best way to do it is just like to go and perform an operation which is find by ID. If it returns a document, then the number or the ID is found. Else, you may use this ID. As you can see, if you want to go with native MongoDB driver that we used in the previous demo, you would have done this by yourself because you would have to have this as a validation, right? But here, since you are going to do it as part of the schema, then Mongoose is going to enforce all these parameters and make sure it's working as you want. Okay, so this was the first things that we want to have, right? So another thing here, which is for the name, I would go with type string, and I would go with, I just wanted to have a trimmed string once it's entered in our system. I want to have it with no additional space at the end or at the start, right? So I would go trim is true, and I want to have it as required, and I would say I just want to have it as an uppercase. So whenever you enter something, I would have it inserted into our database as an uppercase only. So I would say here true, for example. Okay, so this is the way that you define the schema for yourself. So you will pass the restrictions and the properties, or let's say the value or the keys that you wanted to pass, and each parameter or each requirements for each key. And the second parameter here is going to be the name of the, let's say, of the collection that you wanted to create, right? So to be able to use this model or this schema from your own code, which is we're going to use it from CRUD MongoDB, we would have to go and export here. So let's go with module, export Mongoose dot model. Then what I'm going to use the model name here, I'm going to just use names, and what is the content of this model is going to be name schema. Okay, so this is the thing that I need to define for the schema. And to make sure, it's just like always good practice to go with Mongoose documentation. As you can see here, you can see like everything you need. If you want to go with the schema, defining your schema, as you can see, there's a tons of things that you may do. Sometimes it's just like a type. You can just like build many stuff, right? So it's really useful, and they have really good documentation, and you can just like use whatever you want. But for the sake of the simplicity here, I just like want to have it as simple as I can. So now to make our work here, all we need to do is just like to import Mongoose here, and let's try to import our model to be able to work with. So let's go with const here, and let's say name model. Then I would go with require. Then I will go with models here, then names schema. In this way, I'm trying to import the model names schema from here, right? So let me just like close this one here. Now, the first thing to do is to just like define the URL that you wanted to connect to. So since I already have it here, let me just like use the same thing to just like save some time. So to connect to this MongoDB through Mongoose, you will do mongoose.connect. And the good thing about Mongoose is it follows the pipeline steps. So what you would usually do, you would go through something like, then what will happen if you have a successful connection, and if there is a problem, what I should do, right? So here, most of the time, I would say connection error. And as I said, like as a convention here, most people would use ERR, but for me, just like to make it easier for you guys to just follow, I use just like meaningful variables. So here, what I would do is console log, and I would go with just like print out the connection error that I have. If there's no error, what I would do, I would just like, I don't need to pass any parameter. I will only do console log connected to the database. So this is what will happen if I've been able to connect. But now you will have to pass some parameters here. So what you should pass is just the URL, right? So now let's open terminal, and let's go with node crud mongoose. As you can see, there are some parameters here, which is some of the warning here that you would have in the future, or something is going to be deprecated in the future. So it's better to just like follow the instructions that you mentioned here. So they are saying if you pass, you should pass this one as an additional options here, because most of the time you would have an option, right? So here, let me just like add this option. And the second one, it's going to be use define topology as true. Now, if you go back here, since you haven't closed the connection here, then let's click Control C and let's do this. So as you can see, it's still there for some of the parameter, but this is the way that you fix it. The most important part here is the message here, which is the connection has been done successfully, right? So this is the most important part, right? So here we think we are good, so we'll do Mongoose dot. Yeah. So now let's try to do some of the stuff that we did before. So here, when we went through, let's say, the driver, what we did, we just like did insert, we did list operation, we did fetch operation. So let's start with our fetch, right? So the way that fetch work is we are going to do names model dot find, right? Then we will pass an empty one. Okay, once this one is done, what we should expect, we will do something like this. Then here, and in case of a problem, let's have another one here. So what we should do here is, in case of error, we are going to see what kind of error. So here, connection error. Here, all I'm gonna do is just like console log, then just print out the connection error that I'm facing here. So what if we have an output? So if we have an output here, all we should do is to pass this output, which I'm gonna call it data here. Then I will just like print it out here, console log data. So this is just like the data that I'm going to receive, right? Now let's see. Yeah, let me see. This is the name model here. So it's saying it's no function. So let me see what kind of function we should do here. Should be there, right? So this is just like the schema here. I imported the schema. So I think the problem was, I just like stopped the video, so I'm back now. So I believe the problem is just like I mistyped here, which is a common problem. I should use module exports. It's not just like an export. So I think if we did this, we should be able to see this is a model now, and even you can just like see the color of the let's say here is different. So for now, what we should do is just like we wanted to list everything in our schema or in our collection, and we just like want to print out. You can do whatever you want. If you are building your Express application, then you would want to do your work, then return back the data that you received to the visitor. So here, and I have to just like look up how to close the connection in MongoDB. Yeah, I think let's try it now first. Yes, so right now, as you can see, the return data here is just like a list of all the documents that you have in your collection, right? So let's do one thing here, which is let's just like try Mongoose dot connection. I believe it should have close. Yes, so we should have this at the end. So now, because as you can see right now, if we don't close the connection, the connection here will be open and it will exhaust your system resources. So now let's go with this. Yeah, it should be as usual, because here it's just gonna be at the place where we should have it as what we did before. So here we want to just have it in this area to make sure that we close the connection once we are done. If you wanted to use this one as it is, as we mentioned before in the native MongoDB, you would have to go with set timeout or any other mechanism that you wanted to just like defer the close of the connection until you make sure everything is already done. So here, yes. So as you can see, it's already done here. So there's no problem here. We have a list of all the data that we checked. So now let's try to do another thing. So let's call this one here as list or entries, right? In MongoDB, you can have a different thing, which is find by ID. You always can do something like this. Fetch one document. You can always pass as what we did before, ID equal to 2. And let's comment out these things since we don't need it no more. So let's try to run it again and to see. Yeah, it's just like doing the list here. But as you can see, this is just like the data that we received here, right? So one thing here which is usually benefit you from just like make sure you fetch a unique record, you may use the thing with find by ID, because right now if you can see the behavior here, yeah, it's just like, let's move the B here and let's close this one off here. You can see it's just like bringing you as what we learned before. But always you can use this ID, and you may use even like some other function with the model here. So we can do something like here we can do find by ID, and the parameter that we should, let me just like comment this out here. You may use the ID that is uniquely generated once you add a new document here. So you may pass just the ID. Let's see now. As you can see, it's going to give you the same exact result. So you may have like multiple ways to perform the same action, but it's good to always refer to the documentation to see what is going on, right? So now we have learned how to do a list, right? How to list things in our database, how to fetch an individual document, right? So what if we wanted to create a new, let's say, entry or create a new document, right? So usually you would go with the way that you create with Mongoose is to just like, let's call it new data here. And the way it's working is you're going to instantiate a new object, or let's say a model object here. So the way it's going to work, it should be names model. So we wanted to create a new model with the following parameters here, right? So here I can just like go with the parameter that I want to create, which is going to be ID. Let's call it 10. And for let's say the name, let's say testing Mongoose. So as you can see, it's capital, it's just like mix of capital and small letters here. And here we have something is uppercase, right? Let's see the behavior once we implemented this. So here, let me just like copy and paste because it's gonna be easier for us. So as you can see here, what we should do is we should go with insert, and if you can see, there's insert menu here, and the way it's working, usually insert menu would accept a list of objects or a list of entries, right? So for me, for now, I am going to just like go with, I don't need even like here because it's just like one entry, but if you wanted to insert it, you would have to go with object 1. Let's say this one is called object 1, then object 2, and something like this, right? But for us, since we wanted to just insert one entry, so let's say a new data here. Then what are we going to do here? Is just like print the output that it comes. And maybe in your application, you might want to use this one. But for now, let's just like run this to make sure it's working fine. Okay, so to check, you may go with this one. So it seems that it didn't work. Yeah, maybe because I haven't saved. So here, yes. So the inserted value here, usually the behavior for insert menu here, it's gonna retain some of the things. But the good thing about this is, as you can see, we ask the name to be what? We ask it to be in our schema here. We ask it or we require it to be uppercase. So Mongoose itself will learn what kind of parameters or attributes you want to apply, and it's gonna do it for you. So as you can see, the text here that we inserted here is just like mix of like letters here, capital and small letters, and here Mongoose just like converted for you in a way that you wanna to represent in your database. And if you check here, you can see it's already there, right? So this is just like how to do insert. And by the way, there's like multiple, let's say, ways to insert, not just like insert menu. So let's go with Mongoose, create function. So let's go with create. As you can see, there's another way to do it. You would have to go through the documentation to see how does it work and how it's different from, let's say, insert menu, for example, right? So all these things, it's super easy to grasp. And as I said, the documentation by itself is a really good documentation where you can just like, okay, I have something. Let me figure out how it's been done on Mongoose. You can just like always refer back to the documentation. And by the way, this is just like the things that we usually do as a developer, because these technologies is like updating and it's changing rapidly. So you would have to get used to just like go back to documentation, because different version might have different implementation, right? So now let's do another thing, which is just the update. So here, let's copy this and comment this out. Let's go with a new one, right? Here for the update, it's always going to be the same thing. So I'm going to have a new data here, but instead of creating a new object, because I don't want to create a new one, I just like wanted to update one of the things that is there, right? So let's go and try to do one thing here. You know what, let's just like go back to the CRUD and see. Yes, so let's have the same data here because we are going to use the same thing, right? So here, let's just like call new data here, right? And here, what you would usually do, you would pass the parameter. So I wanted to pass ID is number 10. This is the parameter that I want to update. And here I want to go with the new data because always in the update, you would first pass the criteria and then you would pass the updated object, right? So let's now try to do one more thing. Let's have this one as a string. Let's see what's going to happen if we just like do it this way, right? As you can see, the name's validation failed because you haven't met the requirements. And this is the good thing about, let's say, using ODM, which is going to enforce all the things that you added in your schema here. So it's always good standard to go with Mongoose here to make sure the integrity of your data. So here we can just like do ID is number 10, or let's say number 11 to just like make sure it's working fine, right? So here, let's start again. So here the validation, yeah, it's still give me an error here. So let me just like make it as it is. And I just like wanted to make sure that I'm passing everything right. Make sure it's saved and the ID is already there. And I wanted to update this. Yeah, this should work. So it's object, it's required. Let me double check on this why it's not working. So now the kind is required, so the name is required. And I already have the name here, right? Yeah, it's error because I haven't updated the values here, right? So here what I should do is just like I should do update. And as you can see, there's update 1 or update many. So for me, I'm gonna go with just use the update, and you may read like about update many, all these kind of stuff. But let's see now whether it's working or not. Yeah, I haven't set my changes here as usual. Yes, so the return value here is going to be the object, which is going to tell you how many, let's say, document has been updated here. As you can see, there's a number of 1. So the target was 1 to update 1, and the modified one is 1, and the OK is going to give you like whether it's going to be 1 or 0, which is true or false. Okay, so this is the way it's working. If you wanted to update multiple stuff, then you may do the same thing. So the last thing that we are going to do is to try to remove one of, let's copy this, let's remove one of the entries there, right? So one thing we wanted to do is remove, and the parameter that we would usually go with is just the criteria that you wanted to remove, right? So let me just like here do a refresh. You see the update content. We are going to delete this, the last document here, right? So what we should do is we should do something like this, and as you can see, is gonna return back an object with multiple attributes here or multiple entries. So the delete count is gonna tell you how many entries has been, or let's say how many documents have been deleted from your last operation. As I said, always you may use different stuff, and even like with remove, as you can see, remove is duplicated, so you are not supposed to use it anymore. Use delete one or delete many or bulk write, where you wanted to just like do multiple operations at the same time, or let's say batch operation. Okay, so you always can just like double check, because as I said, you might know something now, but at like let's say in the future it's gonna be just like removed or duplicated, so you would have to go through let's say the documentation time to time, check it, like check what's the difference, because it might cause some problem. But the skeleton base here, or let's say the base here, is to understand how things are working. Now we understand how these things is working, you can easily import these things into your any kind of application. Let's say you right now have a data or static data from your Express server, and you wanted to replace it with something else, or even you wanted to build your own API, and you wanted to, instead of just like returning static data, you wanted to return dynamic data from the database, or even you wanted to create an interface for your visitor to interact with you, and they have like their feedback inserted into your database. Now we can just like do almost everything, most of the operation that you need in the database, you can just like do it here.